September 10, 1944. British Airborne Headquarters. The decision did not yet exist on paper, but it already existed in practice. Major Brian Urkart sat alone with reconnaissance photographs spread across his desk. He did not speculate. He counted vehicles. He traced track marks. He compared aerial frames taken days apart. The images showed armored formations where none were supposed to be. Tanks were not abandoned. They were parked in order. Artillery was not scattered. It was aligned for use. 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem, directly beneath the planned drop zones. Urquhart cross-checked the photographs against Ultra Intercepts and Dutch resistance reports. Each source confirmed the others. German formations were not fleeing. They were reorganizing. The conclusion was singular and unavoidable. The airborne operation plan for the Netherlands would land directly on top of a concentrated armored force. He carried the evidence to Lieutenant General Frederick Browning. The photographs were placed on the desk. The intercepts were summarized. The implications were stated plainly. Browning did not dispute the authenticity of the material. He dismissed its significance. The Germans, he said, were beaten. What Urquhart was seeing were remnants without offensive power. The warning was reclassified as excessive caution. Urquhart pushed higher. The intelligence reached Montgomery's headquarters. By that point, the operational framework was already locked. Eisenhower had approved the plan. Air transport had been scheduled. Supplies had been reallocated. The operation had been sold as decisive. It was described as the stroke that would end the war before Christmas. The response was not argument. It was removal. Urquhart was declared overtired, emotionally strained, unsuited for further involvement. He was ordered to take leave. His absence solved the problem his intelligence created. 7 days later, on September 17, 1944, the decision became irreversible. At Allied airfields across England, engines started in sequence. 1,534 transport aircraft and 478 gliders lifted into formation. 35,000 paratroopers were committed to a corridor that assumed German collapse rather than resistance. Montgomery authorized the launch from his command post, surrounded by senior officers who had already accepted the premises of success. No alternative plan was activated. No contingency was added. Intelligence contradicting the core assumption was no longer present in the room. This was the decision: to proceed with Operation Market Garden in full awareness that the enemy was stronger than acknowledged, that the plan depended on perfection, and that dissent had been administratively eliminated. At the moment the operation was approved, the military opportunity was real, but narrow. By mid-September 1944, Allied forces in Western Europe possessed overwhelming material superiority. German field armies had been shattered during the retreat from Normandy. Fuel shortages, destroyed rail networks, and the collapse of centralized command had reduced many German formations to fragments. In strict numerical terms, the balance favored the Allies at every level: manpower, armor, air power, and logistics. From a purely operational standpoint, a breakthrough into northern Germany was conceivable. The Netherlands offered a geographic corridor that, if seized quickly, could bypass the strongest portions of the Siegfried Line and place Allied forces directly across the Rhine. The industrial Ruhr lay beyond that river. Penetration there promised strategic consequences disproportionate to the ground taken. The airborne component provided the key. 3 airborne divisions, British and American, could be delivered deep behind German lines in a matter of hours. Bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem were fixed objectives. They could not withdraw. They could not be demolished once seized. If taken intact and held briefly, they would solve problems that normally consumed weeks of deliberate engineering and combat. Ground forces were positioned to exploit this. British armor, supported by American logistics, could advance north along a single axis at speed. German resistance along that corridor was assessed as thin. Intelligence summaries emphasized retreat, exhaustion, and the absence of cohesive reserves. If momentum were maintained, the mechanized column could reach the Rhine before German command reconstituted effective defense. Air superiority magnified this opportunity. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. German fighter opposition was minimal. Close air support, reconnaissance, and resupply were assumed to be available on demand. With weather cooperation, airborne units could be sustained beyond initial drops, buying time for armored relief. In theory, the operation required only speed. Time was the decisive variable. The airborne forces did not need to defeat German formations outright. They needed only to deny bridges long enough for ground forces to arrive. The armor did not need to fight a campaign. It needed to advance without interruption. If both conditions were met simultaneously, the operational payoff would be immediate. The vulnerability was equally clear. The entire plan depended on linear movement. A single road served as the lifeline. Any obstruction, destroyed bridge, traffic congestion, localized resistance, would ripple backward through the system. Airborne forces, once landed, had no operational mobility. They could not reposition if assumptions proved wrong. Delay anywhere translated into isolation everywhere. Holding durations were calculated optimistically. Light infantry without heavy armor or sustained artillery support was expected to resist mechanized counterattacks for up to 48 hours. This was not impossible, but it was demanding. It assumed the enemy reacted slowly, lacked coordination, or chose withdrawal over engagement. Weather was another variable compressed out of the equation. Air operations were essential not only for the initial assault, but for continued survival. Fog or low cloud would immediately degrade resupply, casualty evacuation, and close support. The margin for disruption was minimal. Yet none of these vulnerabilities negated the opportunity itself. They defined its conditions. The plan could succeed if execution was flawless, if intelligence estimates held true, and if German reaction lagged behind Allied tempo. Military logic did not declare failure inevitable. It declared success conditional. What made the opportunity attractive was its asymmetry. Success promised a strategic shortcut. Failure promised delay rather than collapse. That calculation, strictly military, explained why the plan advanced despite its fragility. The forces were available. The objective was defined. The enemy appeared disorganized. The opportunity existed. It was measurable. It was narrow. It required precision rather than bravery. And it left no space for error. In the days before the launch, the warning did not come from intuition or fear. It came from preparation. Major Brian Urkart's role was not advisory. It was diagnostic. His task inside British Airborne Corps was to identify conditions under which airborne forces could not survive. He approached the problem mechanically, assembling intelligence from sources that were already considered reliable by Allied command. Ultra-intercepts showed German command traffic increasing in the Arnhem sector. This was not retreat traffic. It reflected reorganization, refitting, and command presence. Dutch resistance reports confirmed vehicle movement, not evacuation. Aerial reconnaissance provided the final confirmation. Tanks, artillery, and support vehicles were visible in sufficient density to indicate operational readiness. Urkart did not interpret these indicators creatively. He matched them against the requirements of the planned operation. British airborne forces would land without armor. Heavy weapons would arrive by glider, if landing zones remained secure. Relief depended entirely on rapid ground advance. Any delay would convert airborne troops from a holding force into an isolated garrison. From this comparison, Urkart reached a professional judgment. The presence of refitting SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem transformed the operation from high risk to unsustainable. This was not a marginal adjustment. It invalidated the assumption that lightly armed paratroopers could hold ground against mechanized counterattack. His credibility rested on process rather than rank. He documented sources. He cross-referenced reports. He presented photographs rather than opinion. When he briefed Lieutenant General Browning, he did so within the accepted language of airborne planning: drop zone vulnerability, counterattack timelines, and relief windows. The conclusion was direct. The plan placed British 1st Airborne Division into a situation it could not recover from once engaged. Montgomery's broader preparation followed a different logic. It was exhaustive, but it was closed. Staff work emphasized synchronization rather than verification. Airlift schedules were fixed. Drop timings were rehearsed. Supply tonnages were calculated to the hour. Ground forces were assigned routes and priorities based on uninterrupted movement. From an execution standpoint, the plan was meticulously assembled. Every component assumed cooperation from the next. Airborne units would seize bridges on schedule. Armor would advance along the corridor without delay. Air support would suppress interference. Weather would remain acceptable. German reaction would be delayed, fragmented, or misdirected. Urkart's warning directly challenged these assumptions. It did not argue against airborne operations in principle. It argued against this airborne operation, in this location, at this time. The implication was not delay, but redesign. That implication carried institutional cost. Once the operation had been framed as decisive, preparation became a form of commitment. Resources had been publicly allocated. Allied air power had been concentrated. Eisenhower's approval had been obtained. Reversal would require justification upward and explanation outward. Intelligence that threatened the premise was reclassified as pessimism rather than incorporated as risk. The mechanism of removal was administrative, not punitive. Urkart was not accused of error. He was declared exhausted. The diagnosis allowed command to neutralize the warning without debating its substance. Once sidelined, the intelligence chain reverted to summaries that supported the existing narrative of German weakness. Montgomery's foresight, such as it was, lay in orchestration, not adaptability. His preparation demonstrated confidence in control rather than accommodation of uncertainty. Contingencies existed only within the boundaries of assumed success. There was no reserve plan for prolonged airborne isolation. There was no alternate axis for armored advance. There was no revised drop concept in response to confirmed enemy armor. In this sense, preparation and warning coexisted but never interacted. Urkart identified a condition that required structural change. Montgomery's staff refined a plan that required conditions to remain unchanged. Both processes were internally coherent. They were mutually exclusive. The credibility of the warning became evident only after the fact. At the time, it was judged not by accuracy, but by compatibility. Intelligence that aligned with momentum survived. Intelligence that imposed friction was removed. The preparation proceeded flawlessly toward a scenario that no longer existed. The overruling of military logic did not occur in a single moment. It unfolded through structure. By September 1944, the Allied command system in Northwest Europe functioned as a political mechanism as much as a military one. Authority existed on paper, but power operated through alliance management. Any major operational decision was inseparable from national prestige, public morale, and inter-allied balance. Montgomery occupied a unique position inside that system. He was not merely a field commander. He was Britain's most visible military symbol. His victories in North Africa and his role in Normandy had elevated him beyond routine accountability. Removing him, constraining him, or publicly reversing him carried political consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower understood this. His role required maintaining cohesion between American and British forces while sustaining momentum against Germany. He did not command a unified national army. He commanded a coalition whose fracture would be strategically catastrophic. Every decision involving Montgomery was therefore filtered through a calculation that had little to do with tactical precision. Market Garden emerged directly from this environment. Montgomery had argued for weeks that a concentrated thrust under his direction would end the war quickly. He framed the proposal not merely as an operation, but as an answer to growing British anxiety. American armies were advancing rapidly across France. British forces appeared secondary. British newspapers reflected this imbalance. Churchill noticed. Montgomery noticed. The pressure to restore British prominence was real. Eisenhower faced an unappealing choice. Denying Montgomery the operation risked British political backlash, Churchill's direct intervention, and renewed disputes over strategy. Approving it preserved alliance harmony and deferred confrontation. The decision was not made because the plan was judged superior, but because rejecting it carried higher immediate political cost. This context explains how intelligence was treated. Warnings that threatened the operation did not simply challenge a plan. They threatened the political equilibrium sustaining Allied command. Accepting Urquhart's assessment would require postponement, redesign, or cancellation. Any of those outcomes would undermine Montgomery's authority and, by extension, Britain's standing. Institutional mechanisms responded predictably. Intelligence dissent was reframed as temperament rather than content. The assessment of nervous strain did not disprove Urquhart's findings. It removed them from the decision space. Once that was done, the remaining intelligence stream could be summarized in ways that supported existing assumptions. Churchill's role reinforced this dynamic. He viewed Montgomery as indispensable to British morale and domestic politics. He intervened repeatedly in Allied command disputes to protect him. Eisenhower knew that any attempt to override Montgomery decisively would escalate beyond military channels and into political confrontation at the highest level. The combined chiefs structure amplified this restraint. Authority was distributed, not centralized. Strategic decisions required consensus or at least acquiescence from both American and British leadership. This system prevented unilateral correction once momentum had formed. By the time Market Garden reached final approval, reversing it would require explaining failure before failure occurred. No institution is built to do that. Montgomery's own confidence completed the mechanism. He interpreted caution as obstruction and dissent as misunderstanding. His previous successes reinforced his belief that preparation guaranteed outcome. When confronted with contradictory intelligence, he did not reassess the plan. He reassessed the credibility of the source. The result was not reckless enthusiasm. It was institutional inevitability. Once Eisenhower approved priority for airlift, supplies, and airborne forces, the operation became self-validating. Resources committed demanded justification. Justification required optimism. Optimism required the suppression of contradiction. American commanders expressed reservations privately. Omar Bradley considered the plan unsound. Air commanders questioned weather assumptions. These objections remained informal. Formal opposition would fracture unity and accomplish nothing. The structure rewarded compliance over correction. Market Garden proceeded because stopping it required more authority than any single actor possessed or was willing to exercise. Political protection insulated Montgomery. Alliance maintenance constrained Eisenhower. Bureaucratic hierarchy neutralized intelligence dissent. Momentum replaced evaluation. The overruling was not dramatic. No one shouted. No document explicitly rejected Urquhart's warning. It was simply rendered irrelevant. Once removed from circulation, the plan advanced through channels that no longer registered risk outside predefined parameters. This is how military logic was displaced. Not by ignorance, but by governance. Not by arrogance alone, but by systems designed to avoid conflict rather than error. The operation was not launched because it was the best option available. It was launched because, inside the Allied command system of September 1944, it was the option that could not be politically stopped. The consequences unfolded immediately, and they followed the logic the warnings had already outlined. Within hours of the airborne landings on September 17th, the central assumption collapsed. British 1st Airborne Division did not encounter scattered remnants or disorganized rear area units. It encountered organized resistance. German armored elements were already moving. Command structures were intact. Counterattacks were not improvised. They were coordinated. At Arnhem, the landing zones placed British paratroopers several miles from the bridge they were meant to seize. This was not an oversight. It was a compromise made earlier to reduce exposure to anti-aircraft fire and to accommodate airlift constraints. That compromise assumed time. Time did not exist. German units reacted faster than expected, moving against lightly armed infantry before they could consolidate. The bridge itself was reached by only a fraction of the force. That force held briefly, not because the plan worked, but because individual units fought with discipline and cohesion under impossible conditions. Relief, the cornerstone of the operation, did not arrive. The armored advance stalled repeatedly along the single road designated as the corridor. Each delay compounded the isolation of airborne units farther north. The corridor behaved exactly as predicted by critics. It clogged. Traffic bottlenecks formed. German forces exploited its linearity, cutting it at multiple points. A single disabled vehicle could halt an entire column. Infantry and armor became intermingled without room to maneuver. Progress was measured in hours rather than miles. Weather intervened at precisely the wrong moment. Fog and low cloud grounded aircraft. Resupply sorties were delayed or canceled. Supplies that did reach drop zones often fell into German hands or landed beyond reach of the units that needed them. Ammunition shortages emerged first, then medical shortages, then food. At Arnhem, these shortages became decisive. Wounded soldiers accumulated without evacuation. Morphine ran out. Field dressings were reused. Command posts shifted repeatedly as German pressure tightened. Radio contact degraded. Units fought in isolated pockets, no longer part of an operational plan, but not yet aware of that fact. South of Arnhem, bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen were taken, but success there only highlighted the failure farther north. The operational design required simultaneity. Partial success did not aggregate upward. It merely extended the corridor that could not sustain itself. The Polish Airborne Brigade, committed late to reinforce Arnhem, was dropped into an already collapsing situation. They encountered prepared resistance and limited landing space. Their arrival did not restore balance. It increased casualties. They were committed because the plan required commitment, not because conditions justified it. By the 9th day, the outcome was no longer ambiguous. British 1st Airborne Division was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Of approximately 10,000 men dropped near Arnhem, fewer than 2,500 escaped across the river. The remainder were killed or captured. Entire battalions ceased to exist in operational terms. American airborne divisions fared better, but not cheaply. Thousands of casualties were incurred holding ground whose strategic value evaporated once Arnhem failed. Equipment losses were substantial. Airborne forces that had taken years to train were expended in days. The strategic consequences extended beyond casualty figures. The Allied advance stalled. German forces stabilized their defenses in the Netherlands. Time was restored to an enemy that had lacked it weeks earlier. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The Ruhr remained unreachable. The war did not end before Christmas. Every failure traced back to the original decision. Landing zones too far from objectives reflected airlift compromises embedded in the plan. Delayed relief reflected overconfidence in corridor security. Supply failures reflected unrealistic weather assumptions. German resistance reflected intelligence that had been dismissed. No single battlefield event caused the collapse. There was no decisive moment where the operation could be salvaged by tactical brilliance. Once airborne forces were isolated and relief slowed, the outcome became arithmetic. Light infantry without sustained resupply cannot resist mechanized forces indefinitely. That was known before the operation began. Institutional response followed familiar patterns. Montgomery did not accept responsibility for flawed assumptions. He attributed failure to weather, intelligence inaccuracies, and execution. These explanations redistributed blame without revisiting the decision that made failure unavoidable once conditions deviated from perfection. Eisenhower absorbed the outcome quietly. Public accountability would damage alliance cohesion. Private frustration achieved nothing. The operation was recorded as bold but unfortunate. The political calculus that had protected the plan now protected its author. For the men on the ground, the consequences were not abstract. They were experienced as isolation, attrition, and eventual surrender. Houses became strong points. Cellars became hospitals. Ammunition was rationed to single rounds. Orders became survival instructions rather than operational directives. The human cost was not limited to those killed or captured. The loss of an entire airborne division altered Allied force structure for months. Replacement was impossible in the short term. Strategic options narrowed accordingly. Market Garden consumed resources that could not be replaced quickly, trained airborne troops, aircraft availability, operational momentum. It delayed broader advances while offering nothing in return. German commanders later confirmed what intelligence officers had warned. The SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem were combat-capable. They exploited the opportunity presented to them. The battlefield merely revealed what the command room had already decided. Once the plan was launched without accommodation for risk, every subsequent outcome flowed from that choice. Courage could not substitute for logistics. Discipline could not replace armor. Weather could not be negotiated. The consequences were not tragic accidents. They were the predictable results of a decision that assumed infallibility. When that assumption failed, there was no margin left. By the time the survivors withdrew across the Rhine, the operation existed only as a record of loss. The corridor closed. The bridges fell back into German hands. The promise of decisive victory evaporated. What remained were casualty lists, destroyed units, and an altered strategic landscape. The decision had been made in confidence. Its consequences were paid in blood. In the post-war record, the decision no longer required interpretation. The documents spoke plainly. Declassified intelligence confirmed what had been known before the operation began. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem in mid-September 1944. They were not symbolic formations. They possessed tanks, artillery, command cohesion, and the ability to counterattack immediately. Aerial reconnaissance photographs, ultra-intercepts, and resistance reports all placed them in the exact area designated for the British 1st Airborne Division. There was no intelligence failure in collection. There was only a failure in acceptance. Post-war German accounts removed any remaining ambiguity. Senior German commanders later stated that the arrival of Allied airborne forces near Arnhem surprised them tactically, but not strategically. The presence of refitting armored units allowed German command to respond with speed and force. What the Allies interpreted as demoralization was, in reality, reorganization. British records filled in the other side of the ledger. After-action reports from airborne units described shortages beginning within 48 hours. Ammunition expenditure exceeded resupply. Casualty evacuation ceased early. Communications broke down as radio operators were killed or equipment failed. None of these outcomes contradicted the plan's assumptions. They confirmed its fragility. Major Brian Urkart's sidelining became a documented example of institutional suppression rather than error. His intelligence assessments, preserved in archives, matched post-war reconstructions of German disposition almost exactly. The judgment that had removed him from the decision process was never formally revisited. It was simply forgotten once it became inconvenient. Montgomery's own post-war writings followed a consistent pattern. He attributed failure to weather, timing, and execution. He emphasized partial successes in the southern sector and framed Arnhem as an unfortunate exception. He did not address the central premise of the operation, the requirement that lightly armed airborne forces hold against mechanized opposition longer than their design allowed. Eisenhower's correspondence revealed a different perspective. Privately, he acknowledged the risks inherent in the plan and the political factors that shaped its approval. He did not publicly challenge Montgomery's narrative. By the time the war ended, unity mattered more than retrospective accountability. The broader strategic record left no doubt. Market Garden did not shorten the war. It did not force a Rhine crossing. It did not collapse German resistance. Instead, Allied operations reverted to methodical advances that consumed months and lives. The Rhine was crossed later, at far greater cost, under conditions that reflected caution rather than ambition. Casualty figures hardened the verdict. Over 17,000 Allied casualties were incurred in 9 days. The British 1st Airborne Division ceased to exist as an effective formation. American airborne divisions required extensive rebuilding. These were not marginal losses. They altered force availability during a critical phase of the campaign. Historians reviewing the operation after access to full documentation reached a rare consensus. Market Garden was not a gamble taken in ignorance. It was a gamble taken with knowledge that contradicted its premises. The warnings existed. The risks were articulated. The constraints were known. German post-war interrogations confirmed that Allied assumptions about enemy collapse were unfounded. German command retained enough coherence to exploit linear advances and isolated landings. The idea that resistance would crumble under pressure reflected Allied optimism rather than German reality. What the record ultimately shows is not a clash of interpretations, but a hierarchy of priorities. Intelligence accuracy ranked below political necessity. Operational caution ranked below alliance management. Dissent ranked below momentum. Market Garden's failure became instructive not because it was bold, but because it was foreseeable. The documents reveal no missing information that might have changed the outcome. They reveal only information that was inconvenient to act upon. In the post-war archive, the operation closes itself. The plan was approved with full awareness of its vulnerability. The warnings were credible. The consequences followed directly. No later revelation altered that sequence. The record stands complete. The verdict is final. Operation Market Garden failed because the decision that launched it ignored verified intelligence and substituted confidence for adaptability. The plan assumed German weakness where German strength existed. It assumed speed where delay was inevitable. It assumed control where uncertainty dominated. This was not a failure of courage. The airborne troops fought exactly as trained. They held longer than doctrine required. They endured isolation, shortages, and encirclement without collapse. Their performance did not fail the plan. The plan failed them. This was not a failure of preparation. The operation was meticulously organized. Airlift schedules were precise. Timetables were rehearsed. Logistics were calculated. What preparation could not compensate for was a premise that contradicted reality. The warning was delivered. It was specific. It was corroborated. It was removed from consideration because accepting it would have disrupted momentum, prestige, and alliance balance. That removal sealed the outcome. Montgomery retained command. The alliance remained intact. The institutional objectives were preserved. The military objective was not. 17,000 casualties did not produce a Rhine crossing. An entire airborne division did not produce a breakthrough. 9 days of combat did not shorten the war by a single week. The consequences were not accidental. They were the logical result of a decision that treated intelligence as an obstacle rather than an instrument. Once dissent was neutralized, failure became a matter of time, not chance. Market Garden stands as a closed case because no missing variable remains. The information was available. The risks were known. The outcome followed directly. The record does not condemn ambition. It condemns ambition insulated from correction. The operation did not fail because it was bold. It failed because it could not tolerate being wrong. If you want to continue examining decisions where power, politics, and institutional pressure shaped the course of war, subscribe to the channel. If you have insight or disagreement grounded in evidence, leave it in the comments. The case is closed.